G'day, I'm Owen, and you've joined this week's episode of the Pub Test, where again we are continuing our Jack the Ripper suspect series. And in this one, we are actually covering the most famous person on this list. Maybe not as famous because of Jack the Ripper, but the most famous person nonetheless, because everybody has heard about this person. Charles Dodgson. Now, you're probably saying, many of you are saying, Owen, hang on. You said this was the most famous person and I've never heard of this bloke at all. Though some of you probably have heard of him. But by the end of this, I guarantee you'll know who Charles Dodgson is. So who was he and how does he fit in to the Jack the Ripper saga? Well, Charles was born in 1832, and it is safe to say that he was a very intelligent person. He was homeschooled up until about the age of 12, but by the age of 7, well, he was proficiently reading some classical books. His outside of homeschooling began at a place called Rugby. Now, it's said he did not enjoy his time here at all, and there was a mention of not enjoying some of the activities that happened at night. Now, it was a boarding school, but there's no real concrete evidence as to what that was. But interestingly, he did mention about the bullying. The bigger kids would pick on the smaller kids. Now, as we go through his life, we'd probably think he didn't have this next piece of information in him, because throughout his life he seemed very placid, involved in academia and creative things. But apparently, at this school, if he saw a bigger kid picking on a smaller kid, he'd go give them a bit of help that they needed, if you know what I mean. To the point that even years after he'd left that school, people still spoke about this guy that stood up for the little kids. But Charles, probably like many of us, could have done a lot better if he really knuckled down to his studies, and he acknowledged that. Still, he was so high achieving that when he went to the Christ Church College in Oxford, he soon ended up passing with distinctions, to the point where they gave him a residency as a mathematical lecturer in his early 20s, which is quite intriguing because some of the people he was teaching were older than him. And he actually kept that residency at that college for the rest of his life. But there was one issue that came up. At the Christ Church College, you had to be a priest to stay on the books as an employee, as a teacher. And that wasn't a huge problem for Charles because he did come from a religious family. He didn't seem to be minding the religious side of things, and he was a deacon at the college. So the next stepping stone is to become a priest. Now, it's said that he went to the boss and said, look, I don't want to do this. The suggestion is that because he had a stammer, and apparently many people in his family had a stammer, but because of that, he didn't want to be preaching. So he said, I don't want to take that next step. Now, the head of the college, he's thinking, well, I'm going to have to go talk to some people, and it's not going to be good because this rules are rules and you'll be out. But for some reason, overnight, the head of the college had a change of heart and decided, well, you know what, I'll keep that to myself. And it just flew under the radar. So he never achieved that level of becoming a priest, stayed as a deacon, but also kept his residency at that college. Now, Charles did suffer from health problems in his life. He had a knee injury from some probably sporting accident, I guess. Had whooping cough as a young child. Other things which did impact on him. But later in life, he also developed migraines and started developing Parkinson's disease. But despite that, even in 1889, he started inventing some things. He came up with a thing to hold stamps, which was to encourage letter writing. He developed this little note-taking device. Back then, he couldn't just flick on a light switch, so he developed this little grid where if you woke up in the middle of the night, you could just grab your pen, this device, and you could just circle things in, and then you'd know exactly what you came up with in the night. As a creative person, that's very important sometimes. And he also developed or invented the early version of Scrabble, or a Scrabble-like game. But then in 1898, he did pass away, surrounded by family from pneumonia. Now you're probably wondering right now, well, that sounds like a very interesting life. He was a very smart person, accomplished a lot of things, but where does he fit into the Jack the Ripper saga? And you also mentioned he was very famous, and I had never heard of this guy. Well, I did leave one little detail out in summarizing his life. See, Charles Dodgson was a writer as well. He did a lot of creative works, but his most known creative work was writing a book, Alice in Wonderland, under the pen name Lewis Carroll. So let's dive down that rabbit hole and see how he fits in to the Jack the Ripper saga. Now, I just have to state here that if I'm down at the pub and someone starts telling me this story, how Lewis Carroll, the writer of Alice in Wonderland, was associated with Jack the Ripper, and explaining their reasons how, I'm calling to the public and look, cut this bloke off. He's had enough. He's probably had a few too many already. Someone call him a taxi, because there's no way he should be driving home. In fact, I don't think he should be walking home, because your theory is absolutely nuts. But let's have a look at it. You might have a different opinion, and if you do, put that down in comments. So a person by the name of Richard Wallace in 1996 published a book called Jack the Ripper, the Light-Hearted Friend. And in that book, he suggests that Lewis Carroll, or Charles Dodgson, put all these anagrams inside some of his stories, because he didn't just write Alice in Wonderland. In fact, he said in his last book, which was around the time of the Whitechapel crimes, because at this stage, Lewis Carroll was trying to get back into writing, so he wrote a series called Sylvie and Bruno. And particularly in that, but other works as well, he'd put these anagrams in, stating that he was the Ripper, along with a friend of his named Bane. And I will just read you a sentence from one of his works, and then the sentence this person turned it into. So here's just one small passage from Nursery Alice that this person says shows that Lewis Carroll was admitting to being Jack the Ripper. I'll read you the original, and then how he, by means of an anagram, turns it into what he thought was really being said. It says, so she wandered away through the wood, carrying the ugly little thing with her, and a great job it was kept hold of it. It wriggled about so, but at last she found out the proper way to keep tight hold of itself, foot and its right ear. Now, this is what he turned that little passage into. She wriggled about so, but at last Dodgson and Bane found a way to keep hold of the little fat person. I got a tight hold of her and cut her throat, left ear to right. It was tough, wet, disgusting too. So wary of it, they threw up Jack the Ripper. Now, I am not going to spend the time showing how he came up with that and going backwards and forwards with all the different words and the letters and everything, but I just have to say this. If you've ever written a book, you do not have the time. As smart as Lewis Carroll was, I doubt even he would have been able to sit there while he's writing a story to come up with this high, convoluted way of basically writing a confession into his effectively children's books. It really, really doesn't add up. Added to that, Lewis Carroll was known to have quite a few lady friends, particularly later in his life. Quite open about that he was. He did not have this hatred for anyone. In fact, he defended those that couldn't look after themselves. I mean, he wasn't perfect, absolutely not, and I won't go into all the things that people have theories about Lewis Carroll of, but there's no possible way this bloke could have been Jack the Ripper. Yet, as a little footnote, he did make mention not long before his death, he wrote to his friend Bain and did actually talk about the fact that he had a theory on who Jack the Ripper was. Unfortunately for us, he's left us on a cliffhanger because he passed away before he wrote any more information about that. And I think many of us would have been very interested to know what his thoughts were on the topic. So that does bring us to an end of this week's episode of the Pub Test. Just to sum up, was Lewis Carroll Jack the Ripper? I don't think so. If you think so, then put that down in comments. Have at it. I'll try and respond to them. But if you don't want to miss any of our new videos coming out, then make sure you give a subscribe. Check out the books. I'm Owen, and we will see you on the next episode of The Pub Test.